Can you tell me where your family is originally from?
Yes, both sides of my family are originally from Erzurum, or Garin, as the Armenians called it, in what is present-day Turkey.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me what you know about your paternal grandparents and their
Yes,
experience?
sure. My paternal grandparents were both genocide survivors. My grandfather, Varshag Sahachian, was a relatively young man, part of a sizable family, but he was the youngest in the family and the only surviving son. Um, so his family, he had a number of uncles, and the family was engaged in leather tanning and also some Singer sewing machine um, franchises, so to speak. So he and his mother, since he was the youngest, he stayed with his mother in Erzurum. The uncles, there were uncles in France and other countries and other parts of Turkey. So they didn't go through the genocide, but my grandfather did, barely surviving. He was taken like many of the men, like most of the men, and unfortunately, he passed away before I was 2 or 3. But I just remember my father and my uncle talking about how he was beaten severely. I mean, severely, and kind of left for dead. But he waited for nightfall and was able to get up, escape, and somehow made it to Urfa, where he met my grandmother.
Do you know what year that was?
That would have been, I think it was around 1918, because that was the year he and my grandmother married.
Wow. And can you tell me anything about your paternal grandmother?
Yes. I spent more time with her. I was in my 30s before she passed away, and she was a really interesting lady. She was born, her father was killed during the Hamidian massacres, wow. 1895, and she was born after he was murdered in his own fresh meat, I guess you'd call it a butcher shop. Yeah. And his throat was slit by a neighboring shopkeeper that was Turkish, just randomly. And she was obviously the youngest of sisters. She had at least 2 or 3 sisters, and her mother must have passed away pre-genocide, because she talked about living with a married sister. She was a really interesting, very strong-willed, very faithful woman of faith, and she was kind of a leader type. She was a very proud Armenian. She had a deep-rooted sense of value, and she was able to go to at least grammar school, and she was very proud of the fact that, unlike many others, she could read and write. Yeah. And spoke a little French. So she was proud of her own heritage. She was proud that her grandfather had, in Garin, Erzurum, had had a little grammar school built for Armenian children, so they wouldn't have to trek through the Turkish part of town where they'd often be pelted with rocks and harassed otherwise. So she was proud of her. That was her maternal grandfather. She was always very proud of that. She always believed in schooling. So when in the 70s there was talk of an Armenian day school in Fresno, she jumped all over that, and she and my dad and uncle were one of the first contributors to it. And
Wow.
but yes, at some point when she was, probably a teenager in her maybe late teens, uh, well, let's see, let's put it this way, if she was born in 1895 and the genocide was 1915, she would have been 20. Yeah, her life was really uprooted. And she and, the other women of Erzurum, I guess there were 3 or 4 caravans, at least, of the women taken out, deported out of Erzurum. And she commented that it was a horrendous experience. Needless to say, she saw famine, thirst. She saw she used to talk about her older sister's 3 or 4-year-old little boy dying of thirst and saying water, water.
Wow.
And she also had one story I recall that I guess they had come near some body of water, and the gendarmes, she called them, or the armed leaders of the caravan, were trying to keep the people on the deportation away from the water. But she says, I was really bound and determined to get some water. And so she went, and she says, they're hitting us over the head with the butts of their rifles and sticks and anything they could harass us with. And she says, I got a little bit of water. And she says, I was coming back, and when she got back to her sisters, they told her that they were looking and they could see this bloodied young girl coming, and they're like, oh my gosh, I wonder who that is. She's bleeding from her head, and she's just a mess. It looks awful. And she said it was her. So when they saw her, they said, oh, Makruhi, it's you, what happened to you? But she always exhibited that kind of strength of will and survival. So that was one story that I recall her talking about. Somehow she made it to, she and at least one other sister survived. Her sister somehow married and moved to Greece. And my grandmother never saw her until 1960. My uncle took her on a trip to see her sister. They somehow knew, where each, I don't know how people in those days were able to communicate, but she knew her sister was alive and married and so on.
Wow.
So she finally got to see her in 1960.
Oh.
Other than that, my grandmother was somehow in Urfa, and my grandfather had survived, but his wife and child had not survived. So he was also in Urfa, and somehow some Erzurumci person, someone from their city who knew both families, said, there's this nice girl, she's all alone. You ought to consider marrying her. You've lost your wife, you've lost your child. So somehow they met, and I know she gave me the locket. He gave her a gold heart locket as an engagement gift, and they married. I'm sure it was a very simple wedding, as they were both left penniless and just refugees in this strange city. One interesting thing that that my mother recounted just a year or so ago, but it's really stuck with me, about my grandmother and her spirit of kindness. She was a very kind person too, and she was always interested in people. She was very sociable and took interest in people and friendly to people that were new and newcomers. But when she and my grandfather were living together, somehow his mother-in-law had survived. In other words, the mother of his wife and child that had died. And so he was taking care of her, and my grandfather and grandmother had married and at some point they found out that her one of her other daughters had survived. So she told my grandmother, I'm going to go live with my daughter. Thank you for your hospitality and keeping us here. And I'm going. And my grandmother had somehow she had 3 gold coins. I don't know if they were 3 gold coins she had left from Erzurum when they left, or where she got these coins. But she gave this lady her one of the coins and said, I don't want you to go penniless. Take this gold coin. So when you go to your daughter's house, you have something.
Wow, that's very sweet.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about when your grandparents left Urfa?
They all I know is they got married in 1918 and somehow made it to Constantinople, to Istanbul.
Okay.
And they used to, they did whatever they could to earn a few cents. Somehow my grandfather, I believe, started working as a postal carrier. And my grandmother he found some of his family. They all kind of gathered there somehow. And some of his, at least one of his sisters survived. 2 of his sisters survived. I know that. And some of their families. Since he was the youngest, some of his, I guess they'd be his nieces and nephews, were like the age of his cousins. So the ladies would, they'd do handicraft, like sewing things to survive and make a living. So somehow they lived there for several years. My father was actually born in Constantinople.
Okay. Wow. Would you mind sharing your grandparents and their siblings' names?
Sure.
Remember?
So my grandfather's name was Vaharshad Sahatjian, Sahatdjian. When he moved to America and started working in the canneries, they named him Victor. They said, we're not going to say that. And her name, my grandmother's name was, her maiden name was Makruhi, Makrouhi, Der Garabedian, Der, and then capital Garabedian.
Thank you. And I was wondering at what point your family on your paternal side moved to the United States.
Yes. They moved in, I believe it was 1923. There's some kind of passport I have a photo of, and it says 1923. I believe they left a year and a half earlier and lived in Argentina.
Oh.
With my grandfather. My grandfather had a cousin who was living in Argentina, so it was some kind of contact there.
Could you tell me about why they went to Argentina?
Why they were in Argentina? After the genocide, Armenians were going wherever someone would allow them, I guess. And this cousin she was married to, I believe, either her father-in-law was a priest, and maybe the priest had been sent to Argentina. I'm not quite sure. There's a large Armenian community there that was established in the 20s. It was after, it was post-genocide, but somehow he wound up there, and then this cousin married his son, and they moved there as well. And I'm not sure at what point my paternal grandparents found out they couldn't come straight to the United States, even though they were sponsored, but somehow they wound up in Argentina. There's a lot of questions I wish I'd asked while I could, talk to my grandmother. There's some fuzzy parts, but that family, the Argentinian part of the family, they're actually still, there's some that are still there. and I actually had the opportunity to go visit them
Wow,
some
that's so
years
great.
ago. Yeah,
Wow. What was that like?
it was really wonderful. It was really quite interesting. They were very warm, and actually, my parents had actually visited them and attended a wedding of one of their sons. So the and actually, for going further back, I remember when I was a little girl. I was probably 12,
Mm,
and that cousin actually came and visited us.
mm.
So, the relationship was loosely held together for many years. I think mine was the last visit there some 10 years ago.
Wow.
But
And
it was kind of fun because the one son, the grandson, looked just exactly like a cousin that's related to us in the
wow.
Bay Area.
Uh-huh.
And so when I saw this young man, I'm like, wow, you look just like Uncle Paul. It was really interesting. And they were very warm. They were very nice, very welcoming. So
Yeah,
it was really fun. Yeah.
that's great. I was wondering where in the US your family initially arrived at coming from Argentina.
They came straight to Fresno.
Oh, wow.
My grandfather's sister had been living here for some time. My grandpa's one sister moved here pre-genocide. They moved after the Hamidian massacres. She was married. She was quite a bit older than he was, and she was married to a man that said, after the Hamidian massacres of 1895, he said, we need to leave. So he came here, worked very, very hard as the Armenians did, and was able to, purchase vineyards. And so by the time my grandfather arrived in the early 20s, um, that sister and, well, her husband were considered wealthy. And they lived in a big 2-story house in the best part of town at that time and owned considerable acreage. And they were living, those cousins, my dad describes coming here and said that, they were living kind of the American dream. And they were, um, those teenage kids in that family were doing all the things the American teenage kids were doing and, living the life. Whereas when they came here, they really struggled. My dad's family struggled working in fields, working in canneries, moving from cannery to cannery until they could save up enough money to buy a farm, buy a little vineyard.
Can you tell me more about what your dad and your grandparents' life was like here in
In
Fresno
Fresno,
at those years and what their sense of the Armenian community was?
yes. At the time they came, they I think they lived with one of the sisters for a while, and then they were able to rent a house near Ventura and M Streets, near the Holy Trinity Armenian Apostolic Church. And at the time, that area was mainly inhabited by Armenians. That was considered Armenian town, and there it was. It was pleasant in that they were surrounded by Armenians, and there were little, shops and markets owned by other Armenians. So they mainly interacted with other Armenians. Of course, they went to public schools where they interacted with, the American society at large, which to some degree was other newly arrived immigrants too. So he had my dad had a kind of a happy childhood, but it was difficult, and they were scraping together every penny they could, but they were, and I remember my grandmother, just God bless America every day. They were very grateful to be free and to be able to, no matter how hard they were working and how difficult things were, they were very grateful for freedom and the freedom from harassment and freedom from death and misery everywhere. So they immediately plunged into the local Armenian community life. My dad talks about, his father would hold him by the hand and they'd walk to the church on
Yeah.
Sundays. And they were very involved in the local Armenian church. And there was a band at that time. There was like an Armenian band, and my dad played in the band. There was a whole social life the Armenians had. My dad and his dad weren't real politically, like they weren't involved in Armenian politics, so to speak. And my dad was, and my dad and said his own father too was very open-minded about interacting with Armenians from different churches, different organizations. He says, we didn't place a big emphasis on. There were some divisions in the Armenian community, and they didn't get involved in that. In a word,
Yeah.
But they enjoyed. My grandfather was pretty musical. He had a they call it's called a euphonium, I believe. It's a organ. It's a hand organ, they call it. And so he was musical, and he kind of left that thing in the trunk, and they'd go visit people, and next thing they'd be singing and he'd be playing.
Wow.
So yeah, they their social life revolved around visiting friends and lots of singing, lots of dancing, and while they brought their foods and their culture and their language here, they tried to leave the sad times and the misery and the horrible things they'd seen behind. So yeah, my dad talks about, they'd go play with their neighbor friends, and I mean they established a lot of really close relationships with their Armenian friends, and my grandmother always was about her friends, and to the end she was playing cards with the ladies group and traveled with them when she was a widow. And
that's great.
So
I also wanted to cover your maternal grandparents, if that's okay.
Sure.
Could you tell me more about their
history?
Yes.
Yeah, they had a different experience. My grandfather was the eldest of several children, and he, in around 1908, was offered a chance to go from Erzurum. They were also from Erzurum, and he was offered a chance to go to a pharmacy in Istanbul to apprentice there. That's how, rather than go to pharmacy school, people would apprentice and eventually get a position. So he was going to move to Bolis, to Istanbul, and he was asked to accompany a new widow and her children. And that would be my maternal's mom's newly widowed mother and my grandma. So he said, sure, I will. It was dangerous for women to be traveling throughout the country by themselves with 3 little kids in tow, or I guess they would have been teens in tow. So he accompanied them, and to thank him, they would invite him to dinner and so on. So because he was living there by himself, and eventually he fell in love with my grandmother.
Wow. So
they lived in Bolis, and that grandma she was really an amazing cook, housekeeper, and homemaker. She knit really beautiful things, and I have some of the ribbons from her. She'd win at the Fresno Fair when she'd enter her little baby sweaters and things, and blankets, and dresses. She was always knitting. I remember going to her house, and she'd wake up, make herself a little cup of Armenian coffee, and sit and knit for like 20 minutes before getting started on her day. That was her thing. And then she'd knit in the evening. But she was an amazing knitter. So she was fortunate in that they were already in Bolis, and they didn't. So they had left Erzurum. and didn't have to go through the massacres. Um, so her experience was a little different. It's amazing, but somehow both my paternal and maternal grandparents were on the same boat out of Istanbul.
Oh,
At,
wow.
at some point, my grandfather, although he was fine, he could tell things were getting very uncomfortable again in the early 20s for Armenians. And so they decided they needed to leave for once and for all. So they left. Um, and, it's a cute story. My mom's eldest sister and my father, who was born in Bolis, they were both born. My mom's eldest sister and my dad were born in Bolis. And so they're on this ship. They've left on the same ship somehow. And they're all, of course, down in steerage. And my poor paternal grandma had just had my dad's one brother. And he was 5 days old when they left. So I guess she's down there really miserable. And so my grandpa would get my dad and go up to the deck to get some fresh air because, one can only imagine how steerage was. And my maternal grandfather would walk my aunt around, and at some point they met.
Wow.
And on the deck, and they kind of knew whose families, they knew from Erzurum that they recognized each other's families, and they're like, oh, are you leaving also? Yes, we are. So they actually left on the same boat. My my mom's second eldest, when my maternal grandma left, she was really pregnant. So by the time the ship even got to the first stop, which I believe was Le Havre, France, the ship captain said, this lady needs to get off. She's going to have a baby. I don't want it off the ship. I don't know. So my mom's next sister up was born in France, and then they took a ship and they went to Mexico. So my mom's family, I don't know if they didn't have sponsors in the US or how it is, but my mom's family actually wound up in Mexico where they stayed for many years.
That's great. Do you have any stories about what their lives were like in Mexico?
Yeah, so here they are. It was my grandfather, my grandma, my eldest aunt, my second eldest aunt, and then some of his family, some of my grandfather's family, but somehow also some of my grandmother's family too. So I think the whole group left and landed in Mexico. So they're in Mexico now, and my mom says I'd ask them, what did you do? They were able to take some money because they'd all been working in Istanbul, so I guess they had a few bucks. But they did everything from make pahlava and sell it in carts on the street, and they were doing those sorts of things. They actually, at some point, realized that there was a large Mexican Arab community, so they would put on plays and sing and everything, and the Arabs would come because it was close enough to their culture where they'd enjoy it too. So they were very industrious, and they just did anything to make a living. And at some point, they bumbled into a shopkeeper who was of pretty decent means, and it was an Armenian who had come to Mexico on his own years before the genocide, married a Mexican lady, and that man would help all the Armenians. If he heard a new Armenian had come, he would guide them in where they should try to rent a home and help them get a little business going. So they established a little community, and there were other Armenians. There never were that many Armenians in those early days in Mexico, but the Armenians that were there, actually did quite well. My mom's uncle actually made had a little factory, and in Mexico, a factory could be a room this big, where with like 10 people working. But he actually became very successful making ballet shoes.
Oh, wow.
And like the best ballerinas in Mexico, he was known for his ballet shoes, and the best ballerinas would seek him out. Yeah, so he did really well. And a few years ago, when that aunt passed away, the kids had a photo of their home. It was a gorgeous, 2-story home he built. So a lot of them became quite successful. Um, so life was good. They stayed, the Armenians kept to themselves. They sent their kids to schools and so on and so forth, but they had a whole Armenian society, like subculture going on. And there was the typical Armenian organizations you'd find everywhere. There was like an Armenian Relief Society. There was an AGBU. They never, sadly, they never established any brick and mortar buildings or institutions. And I mean, they never established a church or anything like they do, like Armenians tend to do everywhere. And they'd go to the Catholic Church, which is pretty similar in its, for the most, similar as similar goes. They'd attend the Catholic churches and so on. But life, was okay for the Armenians. They, again, they found freedom, they found safety, and they were able to, thrive as a little community. They had picnics. They even had a Ararat soccer club. They lived. My mom, talks about her childhood with a lot of fondness, because she grew up in a little neighborhood where her aunts and uncles and cousins also lived.
Wow.
So it was really a lot of fun. And she says we'd go to movies and go to Acapulco. We'd drive to Acapulco, and she says at that time we'd just hang up hammocks. There was like maybe 2 or 3 hotels, but it was very safe, and we'd hang up hammocks. And she talks about her dad cooking turtle eggs for breakfast.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a good life. But they sang. They had one of her uncles, one of her dad's youngest brother, became quite wealthy, very wealthy, and selling toys. He had a toy store. No, excuse me, that's his. No, excuse me, that was wrong. That's someone else. He had sold Oriental rugs.
Okay.
Yeah, and to this day, his son and grandson have that store.
Wow.
So they would have visiting like singers, and I mean it was a good life. They established a whole little Armenian little subculture there. They were taught. My mom actually reads and writes Armenian, because one of the members of the community, a couple of them took upon themselves to teach all the Armenian kids Armenian writing and history and culture. And my mom says that in the home it was always Armenian all the time. And so they kept that up for at least that first generation. Yeah, it was kind of hard after the second. But I have first cousins who still speak Armenian. I mean, it's pretty amazing, because they have no one to speak, for the most part, no one to speak it to. But I've keep in contact with them and have actually visited them, and they can speak Armenian. Wow. I mean, it's very impressive to me that, given their circumstances, they still can speak Armenian.
That is impressive. Can you tell me about when your mom came to America?
Yes. So my mom's eldest, there were relatives here and there all over the country, but my aunt came here to visit someone and met her husband, who was a local, and married him in Mexico City, and they moved here. So when she was having when she had her first child, my grandma and my possibly my mom, but maybe my grandmother by herself came on the train to help her have that baby. When she was having her second child, my mom's um, second sister had married in Mexico to an Armenian, and she was also having a baby. So my grandma told my mom, you go to Fresno and help your sister. She says, I got to stay here and take care of this daughter.
Okay. Wow.
So my mom came, stayed with my aunt to help her, and met my um, father, who was at these back in the day, and even during my time, Fresno had like a full summer of picnics. Practically every weekend there was a picnic somewhere. It was all the compatriotic unions, the Erzurumcis, the Mushetsis, there were those picnics. The churches all had picnics. Every organization, AGBU had a picnic. The ARS, I think, had a picnic too. So there were picnics. You could count on them practically every weekend. And my mom met my dad at one of those picnics. My mom is very pretty and eye-catching. So my mom still chuckles. She says, your dad walked up to me and said, would you like an ice cream? So that was his opening line. And I think she said no, but anyway. But I think my grandmother interceded and called my aunt and said, can my and it was funny because my mom says both boys would come. So which is can my your sister's there? Could my sons take her to a young legion? Our church had a young people's group, call them the Young Legion. So can they take her to a meeting? She'll be around other young people and so on. So my mom said these two guys show up, and she says, I don't even know which one's interested in me. But anyway, we went to the meeting. She says, I went to a few meetings, and it was nice. And then, at some point, things progressed, and it became clear to her it was my dad. He was the older of the two. So, in Armenian families, it's always by age. So the eldest daughter goes first, the eldest son. So, and they got married here in Fresno.
Wow.
And she stayed here. In fact, she talks about how she wanted to go back to, she'd only come to help her sister. She wasn't coming here to get married or anything. So this all happened over a summer that they met and went out a few times, and then he asked her to marry him. And she said, well, I want to go back to Mexico and bring some of my things and I guess her own brother-in-law, his father, told my grandpa, don't let her go back. She won't come back.
Oh.
So she didn't. She says, I didn't get to go back. So she didn't get to go back for a number of years.
Oh,
but
my goodness.
yeah, so she stayed and got married here, and her life really changed because she went from being a city girl, Mexico City is just this amazing city.
Wow.
To living in a farm with the in-laws.
Okay.
So, and she never complained about it, but now I'm thinking, boy, that must have been some shock. No more movies, no more going to Acapulco on the weekends, no more whatever you did, wandering through a big city.
Yeah.
Beautiful museums, and I don't know if you've been there. It's just
I would love to go.
Yeah, it's an amazing city, and beautiful parks, and people are really artistic, and it's really lovely. So to go from there to the dusty old farm, but she's my mom's really a wonderful person. She never complains about anything. She just kind of goes with it and makes the best of it. And she learned how to prune and tie and all the things that people do on farms, and was always really supportive of my dad and helpful, and made things work.
Wow.
But it was very, I'm sure, hard for her as a 20-year-old to leave everything familiar behind. She had one sister here, and by that time she had a cousin that was living here too, so she had a little bit of family. But yeah, it was a real change for her. But she dived right in. And in the home, we they're common. My mom didn't speak English; she spoke Spanish and Armenian. and then my dad spoke English and Armenian. So
Mm.
Armenian was always the common language. And even growing up for me, Armenian was spoken in our home also.
Wow.
So yeah, so she like I said, she became a beloved part of my dad's family too. I mean, I know all his cousins and everybody really
Hmm.
loved her.
So you did speak some Armenian growing up?
We spoke Armenian. My grandparents' English was funny at
Hmm.
best, and it was always Armenian in
Hmm.
both of my grandparents' homes. So I learned conversational. I won't,
Okay.
I don't pretend to speak any better than that. But I speak Armenian for them. I mean, most people think my Armenian's pretty good, passable, but it's mainly conversational because I just learned
Yeah,
in the
that's great.
home. Yeah.
I wanted to talk more about your experience growing up in
Okay.
Fresno. Can you talk
Yeah.
more about what that was like?
Okay. Well, I was actually born in Madera, born
Oh.
and raised in Madera, which is just 20 minutes north of Fresno.
Uh-huh.
So it's a smaller town. It's growing, but it was even smaller when I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So my experience living in this area is a little different than most Fresno Armenians. I went to a school where, unless my brother was there, I was the only Armenian
Wow.
there, and um, which was fine. I didn't. I mean, it was a very interesting grammar. It was a kindergarten through eighth grammar school,
Mm.
and I loved going to school because we lived on a farm and we were pretty isolated. There was one car, and my dad worked on the farm, but he also was a high school bus driver.
Oh.
So he'd get the car and he'd go to work, and my mom, there we were basically. So we didn't get out that much.
Uh-huh.
So I loved school because that's where I could be around other kids and um, get off of the farm. But in school, it was a big mix. It was a country school, so there was, everyone from farm kids to just everybody who lived in this area,
Mm-hmm.
farm worker, um, pretty much all colors and ethnicities. And this was the 50s and early 60s, so it was still kind of melting pot days where people just um, tried to blend in as much as possible. No one was celebrating their heritage. And as I said, I was probably the only Armenian there, and people generally just didn't know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't talk about it much either. So, I kind of went. I was just part of the class, and I enjoyed class. The only there's a couple incidents that where some discrimination reared its very ugly head. I had a really good friend, I'd like my best friend, and I'd gone for a sleepover. It was probably something like second grade or third grade when we start those sleepovers became a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to her house, and we're playing along. We had dinner, and honestly, I can't even recall what it was all about. But my little friend decided she didn't want me there anymore. So she went to her mom, and she was kind of just kind of recall her being kind of a pampered little girl. But I remember her going to her mom and say, and she was kind of whining a little. And she says, I don't want her here anymore. And I overheard her mom say, well, I told you, can't you pick another girl as your best friend instead of, and I'm not, instead of that Armenian girl or something like that, she said. And, I just kind of stopped in my tracks, and we remained friends, but we didn't have any more sleepovers. But that was one time where I actually heard someone referring to me as something, less than.
Wow.
And it's kind of stuck with me. And it's funny because they never showed it. And it's interesting because my friend, at the time, she actually moved out of town. So I kind of lost track of her, but I would see her parents in town, like for the next 20 years or 20, and they were always most cordial and, really nice and stuff. But that slipped out of her mom's mouth. It was like, why are you friends with her anyway? And, during that time, I recall too, I mean, there were Japanese kids, and when I think back, they had just World War II hadn't ended that many years before, but we were friends, really good friends. I mean, they were popular kids, and I remember we'd go. I had a really good Japanese girlfriend too, but I remember her parents would never allow her to have a sleepover, and in retrospect, I'm wondering if they were trying to shield her from a comment like that or something, possibly. Not that my parents would be the last ones to do it, but I remember they'd never let her sleep over, or nor would they let anyone stay over. But we could go to their house, and they were really nice people. Um, we'd go for like a birthday party, but a lot of the birthday parties used to end in sleepovers. But in their case, I remember it didn't, and never did. A second incident I recall is when I was in 7th grade, and we got a new young teacher, and he was this. Everyone liked him because he was youthful and fun. 7th grade teacher, and I remember him. And he didn't do it standing in the class teaching or anything, but I remember there was a group of us around, and he said some really derogatory Armenian joke. He goes, "Oh, you're Armenian," and he said some derogatory Armenian jokes that I guess he must have hung. He was from Fresno, and those kinds of jokes, I guess, were still circulating in his circle. But I remember he felt he had to share them with me with a few other people around. And I remember being kind of embarrassed and like, why are you saying this? I mean, I didn't at the time. I mean, I guess now that would get him in big trouble. And I, again, this is a person who actually rose to become an administrator in the school system in Madera. And I would see him for years after too. And he was always most cordial. But I guess as a young person, he thought it was okay to be able to say those kinds of things, right?
Wow.
So those are my own, those little things happen. Other than that, I felt, I mean, I had, like I said, a very happy childhood. We were, in retrospect, we were rather poor. So I guess indirectly I must have felt that a little bit. And I didn't really, I was in the Bluebirds and those sorts of things. So that was really fun. And I melded really well with my classmates. And like I said, I did the Bluebird and those sorts of things. Our schools at that time had like mandatory choirs and things like that, which were actually fun. It was great fun. And so I really enjoyed, and I had some great teachers. I had some wonderful teachers. I had a few that weren't so hot, but there were some very dedicated, wonderful teachers that made my kindergarten through 8th grade experience super, super nice.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And I felt okay. Aside from, I knew there wasn't money for a lot of things a lot of the kids did, but it was okay because I lived in a happy home. And I was good with that.
Yeah.
My mom brought us on Sundays. I wanted to take piano lessons. I have a cousin that's an amazing pianist, so I thought that with a few lessons, big mistake. I never got half as good as she did, but I plugged away at it for 10 years. I did. Took lessons. So our Sunday out of my home in Madera was going to Sunday school, which I enjoyed. Again, that was really fun. And many of my current friends I actually met in Sunday school.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we'd go to the piano lesson. Then we'd go visit my maternal grandparents, and visit there. And there, I'd hear the Spanish. My mom never spoke Spanish to us or tried to teach us Spanish, unfortunately, but she would speak a little with her own parents and her sister and her cousins. So so that was kind of fun. I mean, I feel like I grew up in not only a dual cultural, but almost triple, three cultures, multicultural. And I have appreciation for any and all cultures, actually. So that was interesting. So then we'd go visit my dad's grandma, and we'd spend the rest of the evening there and have dinner with her, and then come back. So we did that for many, many years. But what was fun about those experiences is I could go, well, at my maternal grandma's, I was allowed to walk to the end of the street, which was a big deal for me, real big deal. Just to be in a street and not, have to walk in dirt was a big deal. So that was fun. And then at my paternal grandma's, there were other kids on the street, and we actually became friends with those kids. So that was a lot of fun. So I got to experience a little city life and the freedom, because in those days your parents would say, I'd say, can I go outside, and they were like, yeah, come back for dinner, come back when it's dark. So it was fun. I met there were kids our age, and we'd run up and down the streets. I'm not sure what we'd do. We'd go into one's house and hang out there for a while, and then we'd take off and go to another one. So the life was good. Yeah.
I was wondering if you saw that your interactions with your Armenian culture or the Armenian community changed as you grew up.
It did a lot. My particularly my paternal side, they were very Armenian, really worked hard to keep the culture and keep the culture alive. Not only with the food, which both sides did. I mean, that's kind of a given, but they were very vocally, concerned with the culture staying alive. And I remember my paternal grandma talking about, we have a rich history, we have, great music, we have, music culture, we have shanor, grace, and a sense of amot, of shame. We're a worthy people. And this being, in retrospect, considering the difficult life they have, and as much as they were looked down upon, it was kind of an amazing thing for them to retain that sense of, Armenianness and of worthiness all their lives. So I have a great deal of respect for them to have held that in such esteem in their hearts and tried to pass it along. But as a young person, of course, I'm concerned with everything else, right? Concerned with fitting in, concerned with what do I want to do when I grow up. And I just kind of took it for granted a lot. I was it was funny. So in high school, I had another friend, and we were really close friends. And she decided she wanted to be an exchange student because she was a real Anglophile. So she had it in her mind she really wanted to go live in England. And her ticket out would be, our high school had a real strong American Field Service at the time. It was called an exchange program. And so she said, hey, let's sign up for this thing. And me, she being the leader of the two of us, and me being, yeah, sure, why not? I signed up for this thing, just like clueless. And actually, we were both chosen to go abroad for our senior years. And her parents didn't allow her to. My parents had gone along with my wanting to do this, which they often did. They didn't really keep me from doing things. I have to say, they were pretty open-minded. I don't think they thought I'd get chosen, but I was. So I spent my senior year in Norway.
Wow.
Which was really interesting. Yeah, to go from the farm, first plane trip, and it's, across the world and into a totally different culture. But I really liked it. And it just opened my mind to the possibilities out there. But it was interesting to get that deep into yet another culture. Yeah, and to this day I have friends I keep in touch with. Wow. It was a real pivotal year in so many ways. I mean, it was difficult because it was really different from life on the farm, life in the Armenian community. It was really foreign. But it was also very interesting because there's some similarities in the cultures. I mean, they even in the foods, they have something that's like lavash. They had there were a few things I'm like, man, this is like lavash. This is this and yeah. So, but what was most interesting for me is their whole, and this is very foreign to both, unfortunately, now American society and Armenian too. Um, at that time, and I've heard may have changed a little, but they are a very egalitarian society, and it's a society of um, that's very close to nature and disdains excess of any sort. So, both the person with the most money and the person with the least amount of money in our class, for example, would have the same like 3 pairs of pants. I mean, that's it. They just don't need all the extra. And that was a real good lesson. They'd rather everybody have enough rather than somebody with way too much and somebody hungry on the street. So, and I know things have changed and they have their own issues now, but that was a very interesting lesson for me. And yeah, so.
Can I ask, until what year did you study?
Yes.
In college or anything?
Yeah, I graduated from Fresno State, actually. I went to Occidental College for 2 years in Los Angeles and then transferred to Fresno State. Graduated.
And what was that experience like for you?
It was interesting. I had just come back from my year abroad, and actually, kind of randomly, I enjoyed being away so much that it opened my eyes, and I decided I wanted to go out of town to school. I didn't study the campus. I didn't visit the campus. All I knew is I had a cousin who'd gone there, and I'm like, sure, why not? And my high school counselor was really very kind and actually filled out most of the paperwork with my parents. I mean, these really nice people there at Madera High, and encouraged smaller private colleges too, and mainly because at that time we still didn't have very much money, and she knew that those colleges tend to give a lot of financial aid. So I wound up going to Occidental College, which probably wasn't the best fit for me, but I went there, and that was interesting as well. And at some point, my parents' finances improved, and so they would have either I'd have to take out loans or they'd have to contribute more to my experience to stay there. And I decided that wasn't really the school for me anyway. So I came and went to Fresno State.
Wow.
But it was good because that college experience, again, was eye-opening, and I met a huge, diverse group of people, and learn. I mean, that was an eye-opener too, to be around people from the East Coast who'd gone to prep schools, and those were kind of out of my experience. So it was fun, but I fit in fine, and it was good. It was a good experience.
Wow.
But talking about cultural, when we grew up, I think I mentioned we lived in Madera, and I couldn't, aside from Sunday school, I couldn't get involved in any of the organizations that young Armenians in Fresno have the opportunity to do. But after my first, I think between freshman and sophomore years, there was a Armenian Relief Society Eastern Region program that was for college-age students, and my grandmother encouraged me to participate in that. Wow. So I applied, and I went to that program, and it was a 6 or 8 week intense Armenian language, history, culture program for college-age students in Massachusetts.
Wow.
And I thought, well, this will be a great, fun summer. So off I went, and that was a real pivotal year for me because we had some amazing professors. They were at the top of their games. Like the music professor was, I don't know if you've heard of Vartan Grigorian. He's a well-known, he passed away, but his brother was our music teacher, and he was an amazing
Wow.
man. So we had music, we had history. It was all taught by professors around the country, and being around, my peers from around the country really impacted me. And I thought, we do have I learned so much, let's put it that way. I learned so much more about our history than what was just told to me, or, the few opportunities I had to learn about it. I learned the value of it. I mean, I internalized the value of it, and I internalized the value of preserving our culture and not just letting it go away. And so that was a real important summer for me. I mean, I took a new and more formal interest in the music, history, literature, just everything Armenian. So
that's great.
Kind of decided that yes, I am Armenian, and I want to stay Armenian, and I want to preserve this for future generations. It's worth hanging on to.
And can you tell me about what you did after college?
So after college, my father and his brother had begun a raisin processing company in the 60s while I was young. And it was a very difficult business to start, and they, struggled for many years, as new businesses often do. So when I graduated from college, all my life I thought I want to be a school teacher. And somehow in college I decided I did not want to be a school teacher. I don't know why, but decided I didn't want to. And so I graduated, like many English comparative literature people who don't want to be a teacher, and kind of decided, what am I going to do then? So at the time, our office staff was my uncle part of the time, with another part of the time person, and another part of the time person. So I said, he says, well, do you want to work here for a while? I'm like, sure, I've never done anything clerical, but I'll give it a go. So I started working there, and found I really actually enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the business. So I just stayed there, and I still work part-time. So
wow.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how impactful that summer with the Armenian Relief Society was, and learning about preserving culture. I was wondering if you could tell me more about how you work to preserve your Armenian culture.
Yes, well, aside from my little Armenian area here, I try to, I've tried to pass that along to my kids. I took them to my kids all attended the Armenian day school.
Oh, wow.
And, I've encouraged them to find something in our culture. And I know it's not always the same thing for everybody. Some people enjoy the social aspects, some enjoy the music of it. For example, my younger son enjoys the music, and kind of dove into Armenian instruments. He was part of a band, and he's learned, I don't know, he's self-taught himself to play about 3 or 4 Armenian instruments, as well as playing other music. So, I'm hoping I'm hoping they'll find something that keeps them tied to their culture. I mean, it's a battle. It's a battle in this country. It's not like, I went with my husband to a church meeting in Beirut, Lebanon, and we were on a bus with some Armenians from the Middle East, and in particular I was speaking to some Armenians from Iran.
Wow.
And they started giving me the usual grill on, do your kids speak Armenian, and that whole line. And I said, well, I did my best. I said I took them to the Armenian school, and speak some Armenian to them. And they're like, and they were chiding me like, well, how come kids? They're like, we don't understand it. How come people in America, they just can't seem to hang on to our Armenianness? And I said, one major difference between being in America and being in your country is that the other, Odar, the other is very appealing other. I said these people are, kind and, free, and for the most part don't judge. And it's a nice, there's nothing to separate you that much. And they're generally Christian, or something that's okay. They're not attacking you. They're not looking down on you. So I said, it's different being in a culture that is similar enough in the important things. And I said, so it's easy to slip into that. And so you have to find a real valid reason to make this extra effort, I think. Mm-hmm. And of course, they looked at me and they had no idea what I was talking about. Mm-hmm. But that's been my conclusion, that in countries where you're free to be you. It's easy to let go of something. I think also as a community, we've done some things really wrong in this country. Part of it is, and this is coming from a grandchild of genocide survivors, so that's very real to me. The hurt is real to me, and it's, I won't forget ever. But to have spent all these years focused on something so painful has I think, it's hard to sell somebody on that. It's hard to, for someone who's not a grandchild or doesn't, it did not grow with that sense of this happened to my grandmother. You hear it from your grandma's, mouth. It's hard to pass that along. It's not a real compelling tie, I think. And I wish we'd done more forward-looking institutions that were, more inclusive, less judgmental, more positive things. So I think there's a future there because, thank heavens, there's a lot of people that, treasure their Armenianness in whatever form it's taking. And again, the music, the arts, everything is so valuable. The historians, just everything. But I think we've lost generations. We lose people all the time. So I think we have to find positive ways, positive and relevant to current life, ways of hanging on to our heritage. We have to figure whatever that is out. I know when I went to Argentina, I was, impressed by the fact that there's like a whole section of town in Buenos Aires that's, there's a whole number of blocks that's everything's Armenian. It's not just a church. It's not just a school. There's coffee shops. All the businesses on both sides of the street were Armenian. And I remember thinking, man, these people did it right. And there weren't even as many Armenians there as there were in, say, Fresno. So there's ways of doing things, I think, that are more productive than not. And some of the things we've done have been counterproductive and just not appealing to younger people.
And going off of that, can you tell me more about what you wish for the community of Armenians in Fresno for the future?
Yes. Fresno was a huge community. Fresno is a community that's been here, my own relatives, but now, my own family's been here over 100 years. And it's a challenge, but I'm happy. I'm encouraged because there's a few things going on that are really good. And I think that college level is, I think, where people really make some big choices. So there's a really strong Armenian studies program at Fresno State. And I think that's really invaluable. I wish that was there, prior to the 70s or 80s when it began. That was a huge step and an ongoing wonderful means of preserving our culture. I wish there was more brick and mortar. Years ago when I was in my 20s, I just graduated from Fresno State, I was involved in a group that was trying to build a museum. And sadly, that came to naught, even though we had who we thought were a lot of the right people involved, and huge effort to do that. We didn't do that, but I think I'm really encouraged by the Glendale. There's a big museum, and it's up and it's
Yeah.
going to happen. And I was probably, if not the first, I must have been one of the first to contribute to that, because when I heard they were doing that, I thought, I know those people will get this done. It's something that should have been done years ago. And so that's really encouraging to me, just to go see things and be able to, walk in a building and say, oh, this is part of, I'm part of this heritage. Um, the Armenian school, the Sunday school, all the regular institutions, those are all good. They all have a little role here. But I think I've observed that we seem to lose people in their 20s, not little ones. Little ones do what the parents say. I think the pivot happens between 20 and 30 years old. And because I saw it with myself. I mean, I was as Armenian, I grew up in as Armenian a family as they come. But in my 20s, I had to step out of this community. I had to go, I had to see it in black and white, I guess. And maybe that was just me, but I think the value has to be taught. I mean, I know part of what I learned from my grandparents, and I don't know if I could pass that along, is I know in the darkest days of my life, I've taken great strength from the fact is, my grandmother could have easily given up. My grandfather could have easily given up. You just have to take that. You have to just take one more step and get past whatever is so dark, and live. And they bothered to live. They lived through not just weeks of difficulty, but years of it, many years of it. And life is worth living. Your culture is worth preserving. So if they could do it, I could do it. And that's something I want to somehow. I don't know how, because you can't. I don't know how I can pass that along. I'd sure like to, though, because that is, if one thing our culture is, and that is resilient. I mean, Armenians just somehow live, and thrive